All right, Alex, let's start. If you could just tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, Alex Moseman. I'm the Executive Director of Talent Acquisition here in Knox County Schools, so Knoxville, Tennessee. I've been here for a little over a year and a half now, and have been kind of in the K-12 game, so to speak, for like 12 years now, just in sort of different capacities, either as a teacher, recruiter, district official, all the above, and spent a little bit of time in higher ed as well.
Very interesting. So what was the catalyst for the transition from a teacher position into the HR and talent side?
Yeah, I taught on the far east side of Indianapolis, and I think quickly saw that, you can have great curriculum and PD and all of those things, but really it comes down to the people on your team. Someone who grew up playing sports all of my life, and I really wanted to be in a position to try to make sure that we had just great people across the board on all of our school teams. And so I think that experience as a classroom teacher led me kind of down a circuitous path to get into human resources and talent. And it's been really cool. It's been exciting to be a part of folks' career journey, but also to have, the people on your team or how you end up being successful, and to be a part of that at a district level. It's been really fun.
Absolutely. And when you made that switch, have you always been on the talent side of things, or have you covered broader HR? What's been kind of the path for you?
Yeah, I've always been on the talent side of things. I like to tell folks, I think you got like indoor dogs and outdoor dogs and sort of you got like the PD folks, and I've always been more on the like territory recruiter. What's your quota? Tell me how you hit your numbers, all of that. And so I've had to learn the development side of things, but I've been more on the what are the events we're going to, who are we partnering with, how do we expand our reach, how are we thinking about the funnel and conversion rates, and how are we projecting out 1 month, 3 months, 3 years, to make sure that we're doing what we got to do to make sure the district has not just enough talent, but the right talent.
For sure. And have you noticed throughout your career, is there a certain district size, whether it's number of students or number of schools, where you see that delineation? Because we work with a lot of districts, and many of them just have a centralized HR department that also handles recruitment. So at what point do you see the branch off into specialization? It's
a good question. I don't know that there's so like my team also handles some of that development stuff, because I think it's hard to delineate those things. And I think really there's probably only a handful of districts across the country where they're large enough to have the capacity and the bandwidth to really silo things from really just focusing on kind of inbound recruitment to the sort of full cycle components of what does it look like to develop and retain staff. So, I mean, it's hard for me to give a specific number on where I think that split is, but I think it's substantial. And I think for most big districts, or most districts period, I think you've got to live in both camps at all times, because I think while it may sound cliche, like the people you got to recruit first are your current staff, and how do you make sure those folks are back on board for next school year, as you're also thinking about what's the available talent to bring in from outside of the district as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's also one of the unique challenges when you're hiring or you're in HR at a school district is, unlike maybe a private, organization or business, you have to have the staff, and you have to have them on a very specific timeline because the school year starts. And so you need the people. And so I think it's a good point that first you need to make sure that you're retaining the people that you already have, or that creates a bigger need to now go out and hire even more people on a very, strict timeline. And so I think that's one of the things that's unique, about recruiting in K-12. Would you agree?
I agree. I think, I always try to explain to folks, I think we forget sometimes the level of urgency that school districts do operate within. Every morning kids are showing up at 7. Like, no matter what we decide, kids are going to be here. And so we've got to have a plan in place for what that looks like, both on the instructional side of things, but also obviously on the staffing side. Like who's going to be there in the morning when kids get there. And as much as I think folks pay attention to like the summers off type of thing, like it's a very short 6 weeks for most places. And so there's a real intensity to how we do this work, because our peak in hiring season is in the spring when like folks are ready to kind of wind down the school year. And so there's just a lot that has to happen in a really short, condensed amount of time. And so it's just really, really important for us to be as proactive and aggressive as we possibly can to make sure that we build the right teams. And we're always kind of trying to think 9 months ahead of time, and do so in a context where there's just a tremendous amount of variables that can change, certainly from like month to month, but even day to day in terms of who's doing what schools are where, what enrollment looks like in any specific one school. All of those things can shift pretty dramatically from, we post positions typically first week of March, and we welcome students back typically the first week of August. And there's just sort of a world of difference between those two places. And so building the systems and the team to be able to kind of have that perspective and to build those processes that can be proactive and aggressive and have the types of capacity and scale that we have to hit to make sure that, on August 8th, when kids walk through the door, that they have a great teacher in their classroom.
Yeah, for sure. I want to back up for a little bit and just also get a little bit of a background on the district that you're currently at. How many students, how many schools, what's everything look like?
Yep. So Knox County Schools is the fourth largest district, or the third, Knox County Schools is the, let me back all the way up. Knox County Schools is the third largest district in Tennessee. We have about 60,000 students, 94 schools, little over 1,000 employees or 10,000 employees, about 4,500 teachers. Yeah.
That's a lot then on your shoulders from a recruitment standpoint. How does that play out, when you start the busy hiring season? How does that translate to number of roles open typically? Yep.
Yeah. I think, we, like most districts across the country, have been kind of navigating what staffing in K-12 looks like, both through COVID and sort of after COVID now. I think we've been really fortunate to make some strong investments in staff. So our district retention rate, not as high as we'd want it to be, but right now we're kind of hovering around that 90 to 89% of staff retained, which means that we anticipate hiring, at least on the teacher side, somewhere between 450 and 500 teachers in a given hiring season. And so obviously the work is to try to figure out how to invest in staff in a way where that sort of need to hire number comes down. And then ultimately we can be a little bit more selective on the front end and sort of shift that focus from, having enough people to enough of the right people, as we think about hiring across the district.
Yeah, for sure. And what's the makeup of your team look like that's responsible for hiring?
Yeah, so we, talent as like a department is new for KCS as of is new as of June of 22. So I have one person whose full-time focus is like recruiting, like the inbound lead, like how do we convert somebody to a hire? And then I have one person who manages all of our alternative cert programs. So someone who might be transitioning to the classroom, what are the different EPP or educator prep pathways that person has access to. Knox County also runs its own educator prep program. So for individuals who are getting licensed to teach in a CTE, a career technical education classroom, we run our own EPP. So we like to say we have these future-focused academies. It also requires us to sort of mirror that back to the workforce. And so if somebody wants to translate industry experience into the classroom, the KCS EPP is the vehicle to do that work in a classroom. And so I've got a team of kind of 3 full-time folks focused on different types of pipeline work. And then we also have a regional structure to try to make the district feel a little bit smaller, even though it is quite big. So we have 5 regions across the district. Each one of those regions has an HR liaison who I kind of would refer to as like the customer success person. That's who they go to think through any number of staffing issues or HR issues that they have in their building. So kind of all in a team of 10 and sort of split almost halfway down the middle. I like to think of it as like we've got one team that's kind of product, one team that's customer success, and they're both kind of providing feedback back and forth, and then think about our principals as like our primary customer in this work.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, first of all, not a huge team to cover 400 hires in a matter of months. So super impressive that you guys get it done. But what types of challenges does that present for you from a resource standpoint? Like, do you guys rely on other people within the district to help with recruitment, or, how do you amplify your efforts? Because, I know they're all kind of working cross-functionally, but at 10 people, 400 roles, 40 hires per person in just a few months, it's a lot.
Yep. So we have a staffing operations team that's like the people kind of processing some of that work. So I would say like that's a separate team, but that's also, it's not huge. It's like eight people total, including kind of clerical staff. But I would say just in terms of the strategy, I mean, you nailed it. It's we know we've got to find or sort of invent new capacity that we have not had in the past, because I'm of the firm belief that like speed and efficiency is what wins in this game, whether we're in a district or in the private sector. It's how fast and how wide can we set that net for available talent, and then how well can we match those folks to the right roles here. And that's where I go back to like the kind of intensity of a K-12 hiring season. Really, it kicks off last week of February, first week of March, and you've got essentially 3 months to get the job done. So we rely a lot on trying to build what I like to think of as like sticky pathways, where like how can we put in front of somebody an opportunity to just tell us what they're interested in, and then generate a lead that we are cultivating and nurturing into the right place. And so what are the ways in which we're decreasing barriers to access to that? I'm worried that my legacy in KCS may be stickers, but we have these like join KCS stickers that people have all over the district that have a QR code, links to a very simple lead form. That lead form automates back an email from our recruiter. And that's like just we try to automate as many of the first initial like lead steps as possible. Again, not a thing that's like going to be earth shattering for someone coming in from like a private sector role or just really have done a lot of the work on the sales side. But I think something that a lot of districts haven't necessarily spent a ton of time and resources on is like, how can we get as close to converting that person in as personalized a way as possible with as little capacity from like active work from the team. And so that's one example. But I think building off of that simplicity, it's how do we make sure that we're, I like to say, democratizing the work that we make, because that interaction can be so simple and so accessible. How do we get that into the hands of as many people as possible? So that's the big goal, is like our North Star is always, no matter who you are, what your background is, if you want to teach in Knox County Schools and you take a couple simple steps of just filling out like an information questionnaire, we can get you, 1 or 2 clicks away from the exact right thing that you need to be doing in a matter of hours.
Interesting. So you're cultivating these relationships with people that aren't even in K through 12 potentially at this point in their career, and you're guiding them to what they need to do to get into the district, and it serves as like a whole nother talent pool versus just going after existing teachers.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Like, yes, existing teachers and current undergrads are a big chunk of our market, but I think what we've really relied on is the strongest strategy we could possibly have is to be able to answer that question of, no matter where you're starting from, if we can answer the question of how you get there, that ultimately is going to build the most comprehensive strategy for us, which then is going to free up additional capacity to invest back into the, like, once you're in a classroom or once you've started that onboarding process, we now know a lot more about that person and have had a clear singular pathway of what they're going down that helps us understand the different types of investments we've got to make sure that we support those people. And I would say the risk is trying to make sure that we're not developing almost this, like, said this morning in a meeting, like this whack-a-mole approach to, well, we've got this one type of pathway and support for this one profile of person. And then there's this whole other thing if you're a traditionally trained teacher or you have teaching experience. It's more that we want to set a clear common bar for what we mean when we say a great educator in Knox County Schools. And then say that where you are along that path may be different, but we're going to have the systems and supports to get you there.
Yep. And I think in some ways, like, you hear this a lot in the private sector about employer branding. I think what you guys are doing with this program and nurturing those relationships with candidates that want to get into a career in K through 12, that's almost like your version of the private employer branding where, that's putting you guys and setting you apart. Is that the way that you look at it?
Absolutely. I mean, I guess it sort of depends on like when this episode comes out, but I would say watch this space, as they say. We are we're very close on that front to having a more like codified employer brand that we'll be able to use as that platform for how we talk about what it means to work in Knox County schools. But absolutely, I mean, I think my orientation has always been, especially in a large district, we have to stop thinking of ourselves as like competing with only districts or competing just for like new graduates or whatever, and just put a stake in the ground and say, working in Knox County schools is a great place to work, full stop. Not sort of as a separate bar for what it means to work in K-12 or in nonprofit or government or whatever. It is that we compare ourselves and compete against private sector entities across our landscape. And so I think we know and acknowledge the challenge that it is to compete as a K-12 organization against, more private sector or corporate employers, but that's what our community deserves, and that's what our students deserve.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And you also hear just broadly about the teacher shortage, and so I think by casting that wider net, you somewhat offset some of those other challenges when maybe there's not as many people that are on the market that are current teachers in order to fill the number of roles that you guys have to fill.
Yeah. And I would say, you brought up teacher shortage, so I'll do my spiel on it. But I always try to push people to reframe it just in the context of that, that competition for great talent is high, and as a district we have to compete for that. And I think it's important, for us to frame the challenges around staffing as an opportunity for us to think differently, rather than to consistently come back to we just need more teachers, because I think that becomes kind of a vicious cycle. And a lot of the solutions that you hear in those conversations are the same things that we should be doing to really value our staff and value the role of teachers. And so I think it is, again, just comes back to making sure that we're being competitive for people who are great, full stop.
Yep. And because you have to compete with organizations in the private sector, what type of, I don't know if it's challenges or it's more just things you have to do that are above and beyond what maybe your typical school district would do to compete for that talent with, organizations that are maybe investing in more tools or have more resources because, they're private. So what does that present for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the first thing is just resources, right? I think we sort of forget sometimes that as a school district, we have a very limited ability to influence the amount of revenue we have. And ultimately our job is to figure out the most competitive and efficient way to allocate those resources. And the majority of that is going to be through compensation. And so competitive compensation is always going to be kind of the most challenging component of what we do within a school system. So I think it's important for folks to focus on that and have a really tight lens on how they're being really efficient with their time and resources to try to make as many investments in employee compensation as they can, recognizing that there's still a financial reality that every district has to work within. And so I think it's how do you squeeze more out of everything you've got to make sure that you're paying people competitively? And then once you've done that, I think it's then trying to figure out how do you extend and build value, that sort of employee value conversation we started to have about what are the ways in which you can make sure that all of your staff feel seen and heard and valued. What are the messages that both your leaders at the school level, but also the district level, are acknowledging the importance and the value of their staff members? How do you create space for community partners to come in and just say that teachers are appreciated? Sort of one question that we've been kind of as a rallying cry around teachers in Knox County is this idea of what would it look like if every day were Teacher Appreciation Day in Knox County? And so what are the ways in which you extend the investments you're making around compensation to be something that folks really value above and beyond the dollars that they've got in their pocket? So I think that's the sort of the next place that I would encourage folks to think about is how do you actually build that value? And then I think the last thing, I think you hear about this a lot. It becomes, I think, the place that folks go just because it's a controllable thing for districts is professional development. I think it's important to invest in those things, but I would push folks to go beyond just I think there's a lot of sit and get PD in districts and really think about what are the growth based coaching structures we have. I think every district is thinking about student growth. I would push folks to think as much as they can as well about employee growth and what are the systems and structures you have in place to make sure that as a staff member, my coaching cycles are much more about growing and less about compliance.
Yep. And that fulfills, two purposes for you on the talent side, right? With retention, meaning
Absolutely.
you don't have to hire as many people if they feel like the district's investing in their own professional development. And then as a way to attract new talent, when you can show them all the things that you're doing on the professional development side, it makes your job easier as well. How would you say, or how do you view the hiring process as a differentiator? Like, when I talk to a lot of folks, especially on the private sector side, is, they talk a lot about how they use their process because, to your point, it's a controllable thing. And so they use their process as a competitive advantage. Like, hey, if we can move faster or more communicative with candidates, our hiring managers or our stakeholders are giving us feedback faster so we can get back to people faster. That plays out in the candidate experience, that plays out in the candidate's perception of you as an employer. So how do you view that as like a differentiator, not only against other districts, but against just any employer you're competing with?
Yeah. I would say wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I think the first thing for us is to try to make sure that experience for someone in the hiring process, that they're also learning about the organization as they do it. I think a lot of places are sort of making this shift, and especially districts are making this shift from, 5-10 years ago. They had plenty of people, and so they didn't necessarily have to think about the way in which they were, not just selling, but like positioning their organization as something that people should want to be a part of. But I think it's about how you communicate that brand or that experience to folks in that hiring process. And so one of the things that we've done this year is in the virtual interview process that we have, there are some videos loaded into that are essentially like almost sort of short commercials that folks watch, so that by the time they're finished interviewing with us from that initial step, they're going to leave having understood the types of district investments we're making around PD, early literacy, college and career access, success for every student. And so I think that's one piece of it. I think the other thing that we're doing is trying to make sure that for every challenge that our hiring managers face, that we're developing something that's like a small tool that can be a competitive edge, whether that's like templates of resources that they can use, or just hearing about their experience around like the timeliness of it and helping them set up some type of tiny automation so that they can cut down, I always say like cut down a task that takes 15 minutes to 5 minutes. You can do 3 times as much work now. So what are the ways that we're building those systems and structures at a district level, but then also kind of getting in the weeds on that hiring process and understanding what our hiring managers are experiencing and trying to make tweaks and improvements to where they can do that work faster and more efficiently, and ultimately reinvesting back in the candidate experience to where they can be more communicative with a candidate. They know what they can say, and they can spend more time investing in cultivating someone that they think is great. And that we've done the work on the retention side to try to help hiring managers get a clear picture of what they've got on their team and what they need to hire for.
Yep. I do want to call out, I think that's a really great use of video in your virtual interview process. Because I think, to your point of like, how do we increase the capacity of the resources that we have? It's really important for you to get that message or those messages across to potential employees about all of the great things about working at your district. And that allows you to do it at scale and get it in front of them as early as possible in the process, when they're engaged in an interview step, so they're actually watching it and engaging with that content. And it allows you to like move those value props that maybe are reserved typically by many employers to a later stage in the process when they feel like they now need to start selling. But the reality is, like, the earlier you can give candidates the information that helps them opt into the rest of your process, the better. So I think that's a really, really cool use case. I think
it's also like if folks feel like that's a barrier to being able to do it, like solving for that use case is also just organizationally beneficial, because what it has forced us to do too is get really clear. When I say you have 90 seconds to tell somebody about why it's great to work in KCS, that provides a ton of clarity for folks to decide these are the three things that I think are most important. And how do we clearly communicate that? And then I think the advantage of it being packaged in that way is we know exactly what people have heard over and over and over again. And it allows us to really create a level of focus around with the work we're doing in the district as well. Because I think you talk to anyone who works in a school system, there's always plenty of things that we have not gotten to yet that we're being asked to do. So I think the more that you can also use that hiring process as a place to make focus in the work that you're doing, can help a candidate see themselves as a part of your team.
Yep. And agreed. And when you can reinforce it at every single step and every interaction they're having with you, whether it's they're having it on demand or whether they're talking to you or whether they're talking to a hiring stakeholder principal, when everybody's consistent with the messaging and they hear it over and over again, it just like is, really confirmatory for them that this is the place that I should be. And I think you hear that a lot. I know when we hire people at our company, it's like when we get candidates that end up coming on board or at the final stages, they will often reference the things that stick out to them or the things that they hear over and over again from different people and at different steps of the process. And so I think that makes a really big influence on a candidate's decision to join you as an employer. And so it's good that you're baking that into essentially every touch point that you're having with them, and you're just delivering that same message through different experiences over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're even more intentional about that at the leader level of the organization. When we think about hiring leaders, it really sort of began with the end in mind, where we've spent a lot of time with the folks making hiring decisions about leaders and trying to understand what is it that you need to make sure somebody knows before they come and they sit down in front of you. What are the things that you want to know about somebody before they get there, and how do we design our hiring and selection process so that a candidate is learning and getting the signals through that process about what we're going to expect of them if they were hired for the position. And we do a lot of prioritization where it's when we can, we give folks a sort of pick what you think is a strength, pick what's a growth area, reflect on that, help us understand where you're coming from. But all of that is informed by the way in which we've also worked backwards from what are the coaching structures, what are the things we're going to expect from a performance management system that are feeding back into that process, but how is it again aligned to the brand that we want to communicate to people about what their experience as a member of the team would be.
Yep, that's awesome. Love it. All right, let's talk about hiring season and then the general hiring process. So hiring season, you said starts, right about now really is when you're starting to get into the thick of things. So now, which is March for the people that might be listening to this later, through the end of May, early June, right before essentially school gets out?
Ideally June. The reality, I think, for most districts is it's going to be we're going to squeeze everything we can out of there. So if we're wrapped up by the second or third week of July, we've done a great job. I think, again, the reality of K-12 right now is it's likely we'll be pulling in the last handful of folks through the middle of August. But, I think go time for us was the last week of February. We actually start our recruiting process in November, though. So we launch an early interview process every year early. Again, just trying to sort of build the biggest pool we possibly can ahead of when vacancies actually post. And then when hiring managers can make recommendations, March through the end of the school year. So right now is the time, and it's going to be a hard, fast sprint.
Yep. And that was going to be one of my questions is leading up to March, what are all the things that need to happen to make sure that this short window you have is successful? So you mentioned some stuff in early November, but can you kind of play out, maybe the fall through the winter and into the spring, what that looks like?
Yep. Yeah, I think so. I think from a K-12 perspective, I always think that we're always working kind of 3 months ahead or behind of the school year itself. So the summer when everybody's out and everybody's oh, it's great, you're on vacation. It's no, my work could not be more intense than it is right now. And so once students come back, hopefully we've done everything that we need to do. We kind of start our end of year reflections. And so we take kind of August to wrap up everything we possibly can into that school year. September, start to pull all the data and look at trends and analyze the performance of the team, both, at the organizational level, individual school level, try to understand what we saw in terms of time to hire, number of fills, turnover rates, all of those types of things that we would sort of say, okay, here's what we saw in the nuts and bolts, in the weeds. And then what does that mean about the tweaks either in process or policy that we need to make in the upcoming school year? And then start to think about, okay, was that a we don't have a tool for that, or that we didn't use that system or tool right? And so that work kind of happened October through December-ish. We started running a process this last year with our principals where every one of them will get a talent report twice a year. They'll get one in the fall. So they'll get an individualized report of here's how many vacancies you had. This was your staff retention. We include some staff survey data so they can start to get a pulse on like, here's what retention looked like last year. Here's how your staff's looking right now. What sticks out to you? We try to make sure those conversations, one, are not evaluative and they're not prescriptive in the solutions. We want to hear from principals what they need from us. So that kind of goes into, we do the analytical stuff. We do the quantitative feedback from those surveys and those interviews with principals. We try to understand, like I said, what needs to change, what we need to build or develop, what policies do we need to potentially be like ready to send for board approval. I would say that's another sort of wrinkle in the K-12 world, is like we almost always are working with an elected board. And so there's like, how do you navigate those policies through the right process if you want to make tweaks around those things? And then that's when we start to get into like budget and staffing design, where we can start to see a picture of more clearly what the next year might look like. We have kind of rough projections based off of historical trends, but budget formulas, funding formulas, all that stuff can kind of change year to year depending on legislation. And so start to get in the weeds on that. We get enrollment projections typically at the beginning of January. At the same time, we're sort of pedal down and doing as much early interviewing as we possibly can to make sure that when we get to positions being posted in March, we're opening with a big pool of folks. The same time, February, schools are getting their budgets, and then March is when most positions start to get posted. And then from there, from March to June is, like we said, sort of that hard sprint of trying to fill positions as quickly as possible while still giving folks the time and space to do a thorough and rigorous selection process. But again, at that point in time, it's I always say like we're focused on execution, like problem solving. Put that in August. We will figure that out in August. Right now, it's what we need to do.
Yeah, which makes
the sign behind me says "Put up numbers, get to yes," and that's kind of the mantra of the team.
I like it.
From March to
yeah,
June.
I like it. I think, look, it just really shows the importance of all the prep and planning that goes on throughout the year in anticipation, because of all the roles you have to fill in such a short period of time, and because of the challenge we mentioned earlier of like, look, at the end of the day, whenever school starts, 7 a.m., students are showing up, we got to have the staff. You can't afford to like start making strategic changes or even tactical changes to your process in this busy hiring season, because then it's going to distract you from, like you said, the execution of the process that you've already laid out, and it's going to prevent you from getting to the numbers that you have to get to in order to staff the district appropriately. So I think it shows a lot about like everything that goes into K through 12 hiring behind the scenes, and a lot of the work has to happen before hiring season even kicks off. I think a lot of folks think about like hiring season as the busy time, but the reality is like you're busy the whole year because of all the prep work you have to do, because you're not going to have time to think or come up for air during the hiring season.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I was on a trip this week with some school staff, and spring break is next week for us here in Knox County, and they were saying, "Oh, what are you doing for spring break?" I'm like, I'm going to work. Like I can't not be in the office today. I hope you all rest, recharge, do what you got to do. But I will be in the office from now until August.
Oh, so. Man, well, I hope you get a vacation sooner than later. Get on the beach somewhere and enjoy yourself after all the hard work of the hiring season. All right, well, let's talk briefly. Maybe you could just take me through. I know it differs from position to position, but generally speaking, like what does the hiring process look like? And not including the early interviewing, but like when you post the positions, what does that whole selection process look like? What stakeholders are involved? How do you coordinate all that and make it happen?
Yeah, I think that's sort of like the $1 million question for a lot of districts, and certainly KCS is not unique in that sense. So we have a decentralized hiring process, and so principals have the leeway to run their process however they want at the building level. And so, position posts, and they they're typically going to do some version of like a written interview, and then sit down in a phone interview, and then bring the person in, make a recommendation to the human resources staffing team, and then they'll sort of vet the application just from a compliance perspective, things like licensure, background check, drug test, all of that. And that, can vary slightly. Like I said, across the 94 schools, we'll make probably about 900 to 1,000 hires across the organization, both in certified and classified roles. I think the work that we're trying to get better at in this upcoming hiring season is about how do we run kind of like a parallel process that helps us both, I like to say, be talent scouts for principals and talent agents for candidates. So, I think in a world where competition for talent is great, right? Like we don't necessarily have in the months of March to June, there's not a ton of work that we're going to do to really change like the available universe of people who are teachers. And so our win formula really comes down to being able to convert at a high rate really quickly. So how do we have a district level view of all the available candidates, and what's the best kind of talent matching of those folks to the right roles? And so there's also a process that we run internally to make sure that have like a clear view of where every candidate might be in the current process. And if maybe they haven't officially applied for a position that we think they might be a stronger fit for, we're able to connect those folks to positions and see if they're interested in interviewing, and also if the hiring manager is interested in sitting down with that person as well. I think I'll name it like that also can be a very messy process. And that's where I think we're trying to figure out how do we squeeze as much out of the pool that we've got to make sure that we've got great folks applying for the district. We're finding the right role for them and making sure that we close up as many of those cracks as possible. So there's a decentralized process at the building level, and then we try to run kind of a centralized process that does a little bit more like the talent matching type of work at the district level.
Got it. This is awesome. I certainly learned a lot about hiring at the K-12 district, and specifically yours. I know we've known each other for, a few years now, so it's, great to learn more about what happens behind the scenes with you and your team, and I really appreciate it. I know everybody listening, whether they're in K-12 or private sector, are going to learn something from this, specifically as it relates to the time and attention that you guys are placing on, really every stage of the hiring process, but all the prep work that goes into, before you hire, right? To set yourself up for success when, the rubber meets the road and you got to hit those numbers in order for the district to be staffed appropriately. So really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. This was great.
Yeah. Thanks, Josh.